Want to welcome everybody and say we're really glad to have you join us for our webinar on managing regulatory audits effectively. We know that audits can be super stressful time, and we just want to give you some more information and some tips and tricks on how to manage those better. So we hope that you appreciate the content that we're providing today. My name is Gay Esser, and I'm the marketing manager here at RegDesk. And at RegDesk, we're an AI-powered regulatory information management platform with built-in regulatory intelligence. Our platform allows RA teams to leverage AI so you can prepare, manage, and publish international submissions smarter and faster. To focus on you for a minute, we just want to say again, thank you for taking your time today to be with us. We know you have lots of ways you can spend your time, so we appreciate you taking time to spend with us. We want to make sure that we get any questions you have answered as we go through this webinar. So feel free to drop information in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll take the last 5 to 10 minutes of the hour to go over those questions and present those to Jodi so she can give you some input and advice on what you may need to find out for your own regulatory audit. Also, too, we will share the slide deck and recording after this, so be on the lookout for that in the next few days. So now let me take a moment to introduce our esteemed expert, Jodi Granger. We have the privilege of having Jodi work with us at RegDesk, and she's the Director of Regulatory Affairs. Jodi brings over 37 years of experience in quality and regulatory roles within the medical device and IVD industry. She has held leadership roles overseeing global regulatory teams and driving the development and execution of regulatory strategies for all classes of medical devices worldwide. We're super excited to have you here, Jodi, so thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get started.
Thank you very much, Kay. I appreciate it, and thank you all for joining. Let me just share my screen and we will get started. Again, thank you everyone for joining. We're going to talk about managing regulatory audits effectively. So as we all know, audits are never a fun thing, but something that we all must endure being in the industry. We're going to talk about understanding different regulatory audit types, how you prepare for an audit, best practices for audit execution, responding to audit findings, and I'll also walk through a couple of case studies from industry and the lessons learned from those, and provide key takeaways. As Gay mentioned, we are happy to take questions, but if you could just pop those questions into the chat, then she will be able to go through those at the end of the presentation. We'll make sure that we leave enough time. And if there's a lot of questions and we can't get to every one that's been submitted, we will answer them in writing and provide those answers as part of our handouts after the meeting. So let's jump right in terms of understanding regulatory audit types. So you may have planned audits or unannounced audits. They can be an internal audit. This is where manufacturers are assessing their own compliance for their quality management system. It is required that those are planned at different intervals, and it's important that you have a policy in place on how those internal audits are going to be conducted. Sometimes you can have a third party serve as your internal audit appointee instead of someone actually within your facility, and that is acceptable as well, to have a third party do that work for you. There's also supplier audits. This is where you may be audited by another entity because you are a supplier to them, or part of your program, if you have suppliers for all the medical device or pharma components that you are purchasing, you would be required to evaluate your suppliers over time, especially for critical suppliers. You need to have those kind of audit programs in place. And then, of course, you're also subject to regulatory audits or inspections by various regulatory authorities. That might be FDA in the United States, Health Canada, and Visa, your notified bodies for CE marking, and those will assess your compliance for country-specific regulations. So FDA, of course, currently is following the QSR. There's ISO 13485, EU MDR requirements, et cetera. So those regulatory audits can be from any jurisdiction where you do business. In terms of the EU audits, there are different terminologies used for these audits. You typically have your initial notified body audit. This is where they're going to look at your entire quality management system and issue you your initial certifications for ISO 13485. From that, you will continue to have audits on a routine basis by your notified body. They have surveillance audits and recertification audits. Surveillance audits are typically scheduled every year. Your notified body will come back. They'll verify ongoing compliance to the requirements. And then the recertification audit is conducted every 3 to 5 years. It depends upon your agreement with the notified body. And they will do a little bit of a deeper dive, similar to what they did for that initial screening audit. So I put these up on the slide for you just because a lot of terminology gets confusing, especially with Europe, because they call their audits different things depending on when they're conducting the audit and what they plan to look at. There's also MDSAP audits. So MDSAP is a medical device single audit program. This was put into place to kind of harmonize one audit that could be unified to serve as meeting the requirements for multiple countries at once. There are currently 5 countries that participate in the MDSAP certification process: USA, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and Japan. If you have MDSAP certification, then many times you can just submit the MDSAP certificate to each of these bodies to show, yes, we are in compliance with our quality management system under the MDSAP umbrella. And as a result, these entities will not individually audit you. You know, FDA, if they know you had an MDSAP audit recently, may choose not to come and audit themselves. Australia, Japan, Brazil, and Canada as well. One thing that is important to note, however, is that having an MDSAP certification is not mandatory for 4 of these countries: USA, Australia, Brazil, and Japan. You can still opt to just have each of these entities audit you individually, and that will not impact any of your ability to place products on the market. Canada, however, requires you to have the MDSAP certificate. You cannot submit for registration of your products in Canada without that MDSAP certificate. So if Canada is in scope for you to market products, it makes sense for you to get MDSAP certification. It's also important to note that the MDSAP certification, if it is you want to have it in place, many manufacturers choose to have their EU notified body serve as their MDSAP auditor as well. That helps because normally the notified body can combine the audits for ISO 13485 and MDSAP at the same time, so that you are not experiencing, having to resource and work your way through 2 audits every year. You can do this less frequently. So in terms of the differences between an FDA audit versus ISO 13485 and MDSAP, one of the key things to understand is the differences between these audits. Knowing the scope of what the auditors are going to be looking at is critical to your success. So understanding what the framework is important. So I won't go into every detail that I have on these slides, but I'll try to highlight some of the key areas. So the FDA audits, they are looking for compliance to 21 CFR Part 820. That's their quality system regulation at the moment. ISO will audit you to the ISO 13485 regulation. And then the MDSAP audit has specific requirements. They do leverage many times ISO 13485, but there are specific country requirements that they will be looking at when you add MDSAP to your certification desires. So the FDA audits would, if they are going to audit you themselves and not rely on MDSAP, the FDA inspectors will be the ones coming in. So you don't get to choose who your inspector is and when they're coming. For ISO 13485, manufacturers are allowed to choose who their notified body will be. So you can enter into a partnership with any notified body that is authorized for your product types. So BSI, TUV, Intertech are just some examples of those certification bodies. And then for MDSAP, in order for either a notified body or another third party to be able to issue an MDSAP certificate, they need to be authorized to do that. So as I mentioned before, it really behooves a manufacturer to maybe choose a notified body that can do both things, ISO 13485 and MDSAP. So in terms of the audit structure, FDA audits are follow the quality system inspection technique. So that technique is available for you to look at, but it is a much less kind of defined structure when those audits occur. Normally they're much more often unplanned, and it's at the auditor's discretion of what they want to look at when they come in the building. For the ISO 13485 and MDSAP, normally an audit agenda will be created, and you know, of course, what elements they're going to be looking at as part of those requirements. So it's a little bit more of a structured audit where you can pre-plan a little more thoroughly. On my next slide is in terms of, you know, what are they going to look at? Technical files. Normally FDA, they're not going to touch your technical files because those are specific to Europe, but they will certainly look at design history files because design controls are, you know, in scope as part of the QSR. The ISO 13485 and MDSAP auditors will likely review your technical files when they come in, at least a sampling of them. FDA audit frequency is typically 2 to 3 years, but it is very risk-based. If you only manufacture low risk class devices, you may find the cadence of those audits to be less frequent. In addition, if you have MDSAP certification, FDA may simply just rely on that certification being ongoing and wouldn't come in themselves. It's important to note that if an MDSAP certificate is issued, that once those certificates are issued, it's up to that entity, whether you chose a notified body or another third party, they have to inform the 5 countries that we mentioned earlier every time that certificate is issued or updated in any way. So FDA would already have received a communication from that third party that you have MDSAP certification in place. FDA audits are public if 483s are issued. 483 is the form number FDA uses to notate all of the nonconformances that they found during the audit process. So it will be available to the public, and having 483s out in the public can impact you just in terms of, you know, kind of airing all your dirty laundry for the public to see, your customers, your competitors, etc. Opposed to that, the ISO 13485 and MDSAP audits are not publicly known. So if you get findings during an ISO 13485 audit, you do not have to worry about those being publicly disclosed. The only thing that would be disclosed outside of that meeting is if MDSAP is included, those audit results would only be shared with the 5 regulatory authorities for the US, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and Japan. So not to competitors or out just for anyone in the public to know, but certainly to those regulatory authorities in those 5 countries. The nonconformities that are issued during these audits, on the FDA side, they do not grade audit findings. So they will document each nonconformance, and then depending on the severity of their findings, they may choose, in addition to the 483 that was issued, to also issue a warning letter or some type of enforcement action. Those warning letters and enforcement actions would also become public knowledge. For an ISO 13485 audit, they are typically categorized as major or minor findings, and they will also give observations which do not require action on your part, but are simply things that they may say, you can improve your process in this way. You're not out of compliance, but it's a suggested improvement. And then on the MDSAP audit, they are graded 1 to 5. So as you can see, even though all of these audits will be looking at your quality management system, they are handled in slightly different ways. And it's really important to know and understand when these audits are happening, what type of process is being deployed by those auditors, so that you can be best prepared to respond to questions and inquiries. So one thing I wanted to point out, because this is a big deal, is that FDA is actually transitioning to ISO 13485. They are trying to harmonize with the international standard regulation. They published this final rule in February of 2024. And it will be effective, meaning will be in force February of 2026, which isn't too far away. Although it does harmonize with ISO 13485 quite significantly, there are some FDA-specific requirements that manufacturers need to keep in mind. FDA has retained the requirements to have device history records. So device history records are basically the documents that you use to show how every specific lot was manufactured and went through your validated process. Those device history records will still be required in order to comply with FDA requirements. They also have conditions for the UDI, Unique Device Identifier, that will be part of the audit. They have specific requirements for reporting of corrections and removal, so recall-related activities, and then also medical device reporting. So where ISO 13485 requires, a certain level of activity in these areas, the regulation is not as specific. And FDA wanted to make sure that they retained the specificity in these 4 areas for their quality system. So if you haven't already prepared for the transition of moving from the quality system regulation, QSR, to ISO 13485 to comply with FDA, I suggest that your team conduct a gap assessment sooner rather than later, because as of February, all FDA audits will expect you to be in compliance. So what are the reasons for understanding the differences in the regulatory audit types? Your success is going to depend on understanding, clear understanding within the organization of what you're being audited for. It will help to clarify the objectives and expectations of the auditors themselves. It will determine the documentation requirements. So as I mentioned before, if you're being audited for FDA, they're going to expect, your device history records to be available and you to have a system in place for them, where that device history record would not apply to ISO 13485 and EU. It will also help you to understand the risks and consequences of any audit finding. As I mentioned before, FDA 483s are public knowledge, so those will be issued. Anyone will be able to have access to the details of each of those nonconformances. That provides its own risks and consequences, of course. And on the European audits for ISO 13485, it's not public knowledge, so it kind of takes that particular risk away. Knowing the audit type also helps you to align the right staff and experts. So you will need to understand what staff you need to pull into these audits, and folks that understand the requirements for that jurisdiction being looked at. It will help you to optimize your resource planning and time management as well. The notified body audits allow you, typically you will get an agenda ahead of time. So that's really helpful in terms of knowing who needs to be available on any particular day, because they'll map out for you which elements are going to be looked at which time. And this also helps, understanding the different audit types helps to understand how you can better support the audit with your CAPA planning and your responses that you generate. So in terms of preparing for your audit, the first is to understand the scope. So we've talked in great length about the audit types. That helps you to define the scope of the audit itself. You should, if you know an audit is coming up, be sure that you review and update your quality management system as needed. You need to ensure that it aligns with the current regulations and covers all required jurisdictions. As an example, if you've never marketed in Canada prior to your last audit, but now you do sell product there, then your quality management system needs to make sure that you're reflecting that you are going to be in compliance with the Canadian regulations as part of your scope. So this is one area I've seen some companies run into a little bit of trouble. They may reference in their quality manual, as an example, specific regulations by jurisdiction that you're going to comply with. And if those regulations have been updated, but you're reflecting an older version of them in your quality manual, then that would be an audit finding. I find this comes up, I've seen it come up quite often for Brazil as an example, because those regulations, they do publish updates over time. So it's just important to give a review of those key quality management system documents and make sure that you don't need to make any updates. Key areas that the auditor is likely going to look at is your CAPA program, corrective and preventive action, your complaint handling, design controls if you do design at your facility, risk management, training, management review, and document and record control. These are not all they'll look at, but this is many times where they'll start. So it's important that you've got, especially these elements, well defined in your organization, and that your documentation is up to date, especially if you've done work in the past year since your last notified body audit. They're going to look at what activities have happened in these areas since the last time we issued your certification. So it's important to spend the time to take a look and make sure they're updated accordingly. Conducting your internal and mock audits is also a great way to make sure that you're prepared. Not only is it a requirement to have an internal audit process, but you get a lot of great feedback from those audits that helps you correct issues that may be found in your organization before these external parties come in and find them. I do find that having a third party come in and help with some of these internal audit responsibilities is very valuable because they don't have a vested interest in the results. Many years ago, a lot of people handled their internal audits just as it sounds with an internal person, but sometimes folks can be kind of blinded by their own systems. So even if you don't do it every year for your internal audits, periodically having a third party that can take a look at your system kind of independently is helpful. It's important when you're preparing for the audit is to organize your documentation, your technical files. There's key documents that auditors will always ask for. Your quality manual is one of the prime documents. Many auditors, especially for your notified body, will ask for that in advance. They may also ask for a full listing of all of your standard operating procedures and work instructions. They many times ask, what is a full portfolio listing that you have? So every SKU that you sell, where are you selling each of those SKUs? With that, they're going to ask during the audit evidence of approval that you've actually gained registration in each of those markets before you started selling. So these are all things that you can prepare ahead of time. And many times, as I mentioned, the notified bodies will ask for these things in advance. That helps them kind of scope some of what they want to look at before they even get in the door. In terms of preparing for the audit, it's also really important that your staff, and by staff, I mean everyone in the organization, has an awareness of what audits are and what the do's and don'ts are for audit etiquette. I've seen many audits go awry by folks not understanding what the key things are that they should be doing during those audits, what is allowed in terms of their responses. It's very important to only give answers to what specifically was asked and not to kind of elaborate and give additional information. So that type of training will help you significantly ensure that the audit goes smoothly. An auditor may take a walk around your manufacturing floor. They can ask questions to anyone that is performing work within your organization. So spend a little time, make sure you've trained everyone so that they feel comfortable speaking with the auditor. Most companies also establish an audit, what they call a war room, and a dedicated team to facilitate these audits. There's normally an audit lead or a host within the organization. You have a scribe who's going to take notes and make sure that everything is documented. You'll have your subject matter experts. So if you're talking about the calibration system as an example, you want to make sure that who you pull into the room is familiar with the calibration process. So it'll be fluid in terms of who you're pulling in and out of those meetings. So having defined who the point person is going to be ahead of the audit makes it much easier for the leads. They know who to call when these questions arise. And you'll also need document runners, just folks that are going out, fetching the documents that are requested and bringing them back in. I'll say that it's really important to select auditor-facing staff carefully. I have had a bad experience of being in audits or being involved in audits where the person in the room representing the company was not able to retain the demeanor needed to deal with the auditor. They were not calm. I literally have sat in a meeting with an auditor with other individuals. The other individual would leave the room and you could hear them screaming at other staff members outside the room. So it's very important to choose the right folks who have the skills and understanding and demeanor to be in front of those auditors. Number 7 is looking at past audit findings and CAPAs. So every auditor will absolutely be looking at previous audit findings that they themselves have found or that are publicly available. If it's an FDA 43, they're going to be looking to see, have you really looked at a root cause analysis for each of those findings? Have you implemented appropriate corrective and preventive actions? And if you have implemented them, were they effective? So there's an effective verification step that some companies miss. You know, they think they've made all the corrections, but they've never checked to see if they've been effective. And so that's a key part of the process that an auditor will indeed look at. Number 8, in terms of the preparation, is providing the auditor any pre-requests. As I mentioned before, many times they will ask for your quality manual, your SOP list, and from that SOP list, they may ask for specific ones to be given to them ahead of time. They will ask many times for some complaint information. They will ask what products you're selling, where are you selling them, and show me the evidence that they've been approved. So all of those points pertain to preparation for the audit itself. In terms of audit execution, most audits begin with an opening meeting. So during that opening meeting, your key objectives are to introduce the audit team and what roles they'll be playing. It's important for the auditor to understand who they're dealing with. If there are multiple auditors at one time, many times you'll experience that, especially with notified body audits, then you should have a lead for each of those auditors. And I suggest strongly that you set them up in separate meetings or separate conference rooms, because it's very difficult for multiple auditors to focus if you've only got one room for them to work in. So if you have multiple auditors, you know, set them up separately and have separate leads for them. You're going to confirm the scope of the audit during this opening meeting, what the auditor's objectives are, and what the planned schedule is. Notified bodies will likely give you all of this ahead of time, but it's important to kind of reconfirm that scope during the opening meeting. You can ask the auditors if they have specific focus areas or concerns. So sometimes, especially in unplanned audits, there may be something that triggered that auditor coming to your door. Maybe you've had a recall recently or some type of increase in complaints or adverse events. Maybe there was some advertising that didn't align with your approved indications, something that may have triggered the audit. You can ask them if they're going to be looking at something specific. In addition to that, if you've started to sell a new product, maybe a higher risk class device, they may want to take a look at that as well. And they'll tell you, you know, we're here to really look at all of the processes surrounding this new product to make sure that it is in line with the quality management system. You can set expectations for communication and document handling as well during this meeting. How will all of the requested documents be handed over to the auditor So just the logistics for how that will be handled is important to align on during that opening meeting. So in terms of best practices, I mentioned this before, it's very important to answer questions only what is asked. Be very concise, direct, and factual in your answers, but do not give extra details or speculate. And if you don't know the answer, it is absolutely appropriate to say that you need to get back to them so that you can then go external or have other folks go external to the meeting and retrieve the answers for you. When you're handling documentation during this audit, if the auditor is asking for something like your design history file on a given product, design history files are encompassing many documents, drawings, specifications, design review meeting minutes. You know, it's a huge breadth of documentation. So if an auditor asks you for something that is very broad in scope, like a design history file, ask some clarifying questions. What part of the design history file would you like to see? Are there certain elements or certain time frames that you're interested in? And it's important to try to narrow down the scope of what they're asking for, because the last thing you want to do, back in, before electronic files were as popular, many design history files were kept in binders on bookshelves. And when asked for a design history file, folks would just bring these binders into the table and set them there. You never want to do that for an auditor unless they specifically ask you to do that, because you're giving them much more information than they necessarily need to see. So try to get them to be very specific, and then, of course, answer those questions directly and factually. And if you don't know the answer, go ahead and say that you need to get back to them. You need to have controlled document access. As I mentioned before, establishing how documents will be transferred, from your team to the auditor is important. You need to make sure that you're keeping track of each of these requests, because it takes time in some cases to pull them. Auditors are going to be moving on to their next questions. So you need to kind of keep a running tally of everything that's been asked for and be able to check off what's been handed over and what has not. Auditors may go back to things they asked for before. And so having that log will really help you to, manage the flow of information. All documents should be screened before putting them in front of an auditor. So you may have a group of folks that are just pulling documents for you. I'll give an example of a design history file. They might say, a lot history record. So you may be asked to give me 3 lot history records that show 3 lots of this particular product being manufactured. And you've got runners that go out and they start pulling these lot history records. But when they're screened, you may find maybe there's some compliance issues in a given record. Maybe, the operators didn't fill every section out appropriately, and that's an error on their part. And if you hand that to the auditor, then they're going to find that and you're going to have an audit finding. If the auditor did not ask you for specific lot numbers, then through that screening process, you have the opportunity to instead go fetch lot history records without a compliance issue. So it's important to have this screening process first to make sure that the document meets the request. Secondly, to understand if there are compliance issues that may be noted by the auditor. Sometimes you're not going to be able to correct that. They've asked for something very specific. You need to hand it over, even if there are some issues within. But by doing this screening, you understand where the risk might lie during the auditor's review. So it's a very a process that has lots of moving targets during the day while you're going through these audits. So having controlled access by the auditor is important, and screening them before they are handed over. You need to present the right subject matter expert. So as I mentioned before, you need someone that can speak specifically to what the auditor is reviewing at the time. They need to be the most knowledgeable in that particular area. They need to be calm individuals who can speak for each process and answer the auditor's questions. If you have, for instance, someone who's trying to speak to the calibration process and they aren't involved in that process every day, then they may be ill-equipped to answer the auditor's questions. And that's going to frustrate your auditor. So make sure you're bringing people in who are subject matter experts in each area that's being reviewed, and you'll have the best outcome in that way. You need to take detailed notes. As I mentioned, you need a scribe that's going to log all of the auditor's questions, what documents were reviewed. It's important to notate any comments that they've made, because that is going to help you communicate that to the rest of the team. Your entire organization isn't in that room. So having these notes help you to educate folks after the fact of what the auditors were looking for and where they might have seen things that they didn't like. They also, with their comments, may point out directly potential nonconformities. So if you're keeping track of those, you should, at the end of each day, already kind of know what those nonconformities might be that they're going to raise. If there is a concern identified during the audit, it's really important, especially if it's a critical thing, to escalate that to the audit lead. So, or your quality, head of quality. It's important that they know what's going on. This is especially true if you've got multiple auditors doing different things, like touring your manufacturing floor versus being in the room, in another room with a different auditor. Just make sure that your leads are well informed all along the way, and ensure that any issues that come up, many times a skilled lead can kind of work their way through in handling those issues and kind of building trust with the auditor themselves. It's important to keep your audit area clean and quiet. So you don't want a lot of foot traffic of folks that are not involved in the audit during this process. So setting up your auditors in your lunch area and other folks are milling in and out, of course, is not a good choice. Putting them in a confined conference room and only having folks coming in when you request them to come in, that's the best way to go about it. You also don't want unrelated staff to engage in audit discussions if that is not their area of expertise. So if you're in an audit and an auditor, say he's touring the manufacturing floor, he's asking you about something that you're not directly involved in, it's best to say, I'm not the subject matter expert in that area. Let me get you to who can answer those questions more appropriately. You should go into the audit preparing for each day. So at the end of every day, you can, once the auditors leave the building, you can go through a debrief with your staff, explaining, what's gone well, what maybe we need to work on for the next day. Look at your review notes and prepare for any follow-up documents overnight. If there's outstanding requests that you were not able to get into the auditor's hands that day, then it's important for you to make sure that you're gathering those in the evening so you're prepared in the morning to hand everything over. And it's also important to look at the agenda for the next day. Make sure that all your subject matter experts for those various topics are lined up accordingly. And when the closing meeting happens on the last day, be sure that you are listening to the auditor and taking their findings in a professional way. You can take notes. If you disagree with the audit findings, you should not be arguing with the auditor in that setting. So it's really just a listen and take in the information that the auditor is providing. If you need clarification, you can ask for that if it is unclear. And then, of course, you're going to thank your auditor for their time. So that's the audit execution piece of our presentation. And then I guess the last piece here is just in terms of responding to any audit findings. Many times there will be a specific clock that you have to respond. So it's important to understand from the auditor what that timeline is. If they issue a 483 from FDA or an audit report from your notified bodies, you need to understand when the written response needs to be submitted. If you have any questions on how that written response needs to be submitted, you can ask that during the closing meeting as well. All responses should address root cause of the nonconformance, what your containment action is, if you are going to look at corrective and preventive action to prevent it from happening in the future. And then you will need to provide timelines and commitments for resolving each of those findings. I'll go through two quick case studies really quickly. These are actual case studies that have happened. So this first one is related to a US-based manufacturer. They manufactured Class II wound care devices. They were FDA registered. They had ISO 13485 certification, and their annual revenue was around $50 million. During the audit, FDA cited multiple things the company was not able to adequately provide evidence for. First was an inadequate CAPA system. So they had repeated customer complaints, but no documented evidence of a root cause analysis or corrective action. They were basically just receiving these complaints in, doing a very superficial assessment and closing the complaint files. The second observation was in regards to unvalidated software. The manufacturing process that was actually used to control critical parameters in the manufacturing process lacked any type of validation documentation. So although it was intended to control, they never proved that it would adequately do that. In addition, they had incomplete complaint files. Many complaint records were missing investigation results or closure summaries. So that was noted as a finding. And then their documentation had issues just in terms of being able to retrieve the standard operating procedures that covered all of the quality system elements and other documentation upon request. So they just weren't able to give the auditor everything that was needed. As a result, FDA issued a 483 with 6 observations, and the company responded to those, but unfortunately their response was not deemed adequate. They were still lacking in what they told FDA they would do to correct these matters. So FDA in turn issued a warning letter. And then this ended up, once you're under warning letter, it impacts your ability to get products approved in the United States. So this ended up delaying a 510K submission review. And of course, once you have a warning letter with FDA, you are under scrutiny from them at a much higher level than you may previously have been. So key lessons learned, of course, and this area was that your CAPA system must be closed looped and timely with proper documentation. Software impacting critical processes or quality of your product must be validated. Your complaint handling must be consistent, thorough, and traceable. You need to, do more than a superficial complaint review. And your document control, your documents touch every part of your process and your organization. So that system needs to be organized and ensure that you can retrieve everything that's needed during the audit process. The second case study was actually for EU MDR. The notified body was auditing this organization to, for their ISO 13485. The manufacturer was headquartered in the EU itself, and they were a manufacturer of orthopedic implants, Class 2B. They were transitioning from the Medical Device Directive to the MDR, which is the new regulation that European companies need to comply with, or all companies that sell in the EU. They were selling globally with the CE mark as the main market access. So during the audit, the initial MDR certification, the notified body found major nonconformities. First was incomplete technical documentation. So they had implant devices that lacked their clinical evaluation reports that met the MDR requirement. They had no post-market surveillance plans in place that were updated for MDR requirements. They also did not have a formally designated person responsible for regulatory compliance. So a PRRC designee is a specific requirement for Europe. And unfortunately, in this case, they did not have that person as the documented PRRC. And that was a major audit finding. And then the last related to their CAPAs. Previous audit findings had been addressed, but they had not complied with the plans, and the dates were unrealistic. So ultimately, in this particular case, the notified body suspended their CE certificate until those major nonconformities could be found. So what that ended up doing is halting all distribution of product into the EU. And if the product bore the CE mark and they were also selling to other markets, they couldn't sell to those other markets either because the CE at that time was no longer valid. So it really made a huge impact in terms of their organization. So in this particular case, what they failed to do was really understand the differences between MDD and MDR and make sure that all of those related items were addressed adequately in their quality management system, and that their PMS system was structured and proactive and in place. They needed to have the PRRC documented, and that is a legal requirement as part of the MDR legislation. And then, of course, as I mentioned, their CAPAs, they really needed to demonstrate that they were realistic timelines, that they were resourced to be able to close those CAPAs in a timely manner, and that the auditors actually saw evidence that they had worked to implement adequate corrections and that they were effective. So the key takeaways to understand when you're preparing for an audit and getting through this process without any, as few observations as possible and no major compliance issue is first, as I mentioned, to understand your audit scope, to prepare everything possible. By utilizing that scope, you're going to understand ahead of time what they're going to look at. So get everything organized and do some reviews to make sure that things are up to date, and that'll make your audit process run much more smoothly. Put the right people in the room. Make sure that you've got good leads for the auditors that can manage the audit properly. They have the right demeanor, they have the right skill set, and then pull in your subject matter experts when specific topics really need that level of expertise. Be disciplined in your execution. Auditors don't like to wait for things. So if you're struggling with getting documents in a timely manner to them, it is not going to bode well for how they feel your quality management system is established. And then lastly, make sure that you respond to your audit findings within the required timeframes, and that those responses are going to be sufficient in order to ensure that the auditor feels that you have taken their findings seriously and that you're going to be correcting them in an adequate way. So now I'll turn it back over to Gay. We're going to take any questions that came through in the chat. And as I mentioned, if we can't get to all of them, we only have a few minutes left. If we can't get to all of them, we'll provide some written responses.
Yeah, we do have a lot of questions, so I think we'll be having to supply some of those in when I send out the webinar and the replay. So let's just get started on a couple, and I think you might have answered some of these, so maybe we can go through a few really quickly. What requirement is being fulfilled by having required internal planned audits? Is this US FDA requirement or ISO 13485?
Having internal audit plans is relative really to all jurisdictions. You need to be able to assess the health of your quality system. So it's important that plan is in place, that it is documented, and normally a schedule for those audits is a lot of times your quality team will issue that schedule at the beginning of the year. What are we going to look at? When are we going to look at it? And then they'll be able to produce the objective evidence from those being conducted.
Okay, perfect. And then any insight on how the FDA's upcoming implementation of the ELSA AI tool may affect inspections, and any tips for preparing for AI facilitated inspections?
Sure. Well, I can say on the AI side, what it may allow FDA to do more effectively is really look at data that they're getting on a routine basis regarding complaints and things like that, and looking at, okay, we see based on our AI assessment, there's spikes in complaints at this given organization. They have a high risk class device, but we're seeing, added issues based on the adverse events being submitted. That may trigger FDA to prioritize your facility as a company they want to take a look at. Whereas if their AI is kind of everything's silenced, they might not look at you as closely. Now, during the process of doing the audit for AI, I'm not sure how they're going to implement that for the audit process yet. But if they have tools that allow them to look at more documents more quickly and things of that nature, then that might just broaden the scope of how much they can look at in the time that's been allotted for the audit.
All right, and then let's do what's the estimated cost for an MDSAP audit, and what variables are associated with the cost?
Costs are varied by notified body, so I couldn't tell you what the current going rate is. It's going to depend on the scope of your company, how large is your company, how many facilities, how many products you sell, what the risk classifications are for those products. If you have multiple sites, it's certainly going to increase the cost. They will ask you all of these clarifying questions when you engage the notified body, and then they will develop a quotation for you. And as I said, it may vary depending upon which notified body you go to. There are not set costs for every notified body to use.
Okay, we're getting more and more questions, so we definitely are going to have to reply to you guys and let you know, because we are almost out of time. I'm going to do one more real quick. Could I argue based on legislation or ISO if I disagree with the auditor?
If you disagree with an auditor, you can certainly in a very professional way, kind of cite what the regulation is, and just simply say, my understanding based on this regulation is that this is what is required, and we believe we've met that, and see what the auditor responds. If they are adamant that they still feel something is lacking, it is not in your best interest during the audit process to be arguing with them during that setting. You will have the opportunity, if they give you an audit finding, to put all of that in writing during your response.
Okay, well, I think that wraps up our time. I don't want to hold anybody past the time. So again, we'll send out the replay and the slide deck and answer any of the questions and send that out to you as well. So be looking for that in the next couple of days. Jodi, thanks again for everything. You provide such valuable information. And I know for the next audits, you will definitely help people be a little more prepared. So thanks again for your time.
Yes, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate you spending time with us today. Thank you.